around him. And it's not that he was throwing fits and kicking over C-stands and throwing boxes or anything.
And so I'm living that dream, and it's wonderful.
Every day, I bring you another chapter from Hollywood's golden years, the stories behind the stars we grew up watching, and the moments that defined an unforgettable time. These memories deserve to be preserved, and I'm grateful you're here to keep them alive with me. If you enjoy these journeys back in time, I hope you'll hit that subscribe button. It doesn't cost a thing, but it means the world. Thank you for being part of this community. Now, let's get started. Ron Howard has always been one of the good guys in Hollywood, a director known for treating people with respect and keeping his word. But when someone asked him about the darker side of the industry that raised him, you could see his whole expression change. He said something that stopped people in their tracks. The public wouldn't believe what some of our beloved stars were really like once the cameras stopped rolling. That era we all remember so fondly? According to Howard, it wasn't nearly as glamorous as it seemed. He described a world built on secrets, pressure, and people being pushed around. Errol Flynn, the troublemaker behind the charm. Long before James Bond or Jack Sparrow, there was Errol Flynn, the swashbuckling star who made adventure movies what they were. On screen, he was everything we wanted in a hero: brave, handsome, and always ready for action. Off-screen, Howard tells us, he was a very different person, reckless, selfish, and living life on the edge. Born in Tasmania back in 1909, Flynn hit Hollywood in the 30s and became an overnight sensation after Captain Blood in 1935. Warner Brothers made a fortune off his good looks and charm. But underneath all that polish was a man struggling with serious personal problems and addiction. By the early 1940s, things started falling apart. In 1942, he found himself in serious legal trouble involving two young women, Peggy Satterlee and Betty Hansen. The newspapers went crazy with the story, and the whole country took sides. Flynn acted like it was all a joke, as if being a movie star meant he was above the law. Warner Brothers brought in their top lawyers. Fans camped outside the courthouse, and people in the know whispered about witnesses who suddenly disappeared after being pressured by powerful folks. Flynn was found not guilty, but the cloud hanging over him only got darker. Years later, private letters from 1978 showed him actually bragging about his behavior and laughing at people who said they were scared of him. Ron Howard said that reading about this trial opened his eyes. It was when he realized Hollywood would protect anyone who looked good on camera, no matter what they'd done. To the public, Flynn stayed a rebel hero. To those who knew the truth, Kirk Douglas, the star who wouldn't back down. To Ron Howard, Kirk Douglas was a walking contradiction. On screen, he talked about doing what's right, standing up for others, and being a man of principle. But the people who actually worked with him? They remembered someone very different, tough, intimidating, and always spoiling for a fight. Born Isser Danielovich in 1916 to immigrant parents who had next to nothing, Douglas clawed his way to the top through pure grit. By the time Spartacus made him a household name, he had it all: power, money, and respect. But people on his sets said he had a temper that could clear a room. Crew members described him as impossible to please, snapping at people without warning and keeping everyone on edge. Actress Deborah Paget once said he didn't just want to be in charge of a scene, he wanted to control everyone in it. Ron Howard, who studied Douglas's work when he was learning to direct, later said there was a rage underneath that famous smile, the kind that eats away at a person from the inside. That intensity followed Douglas his whole career. Over the years, a lot of old Hollywood insiders have shared troubling stories about how he treated women. Some writers and people connected to the business have talked about claims from the 1950s involving Natalie Wood, pointing to what her sister Lana wrote in a 2018 book. These stories have been argued about for years, and because the main people involved have passed on, Howard emphasizes that these kinds of accusations show us more about the secretive, complicated culture of that time than they prove any specific facts. Douglas was never charged with anything, and the whole situation got buried under the same wall of silence that protected plenty of powerful men back then.
Faye Dunaway, when perfection turned cruel. If Errol Flynn represented corruption and Kirk Douglas stood for explosive anger, then Faye Dunaway was a different kind of problem altogether. To Ron Howard, she proved that Hollywood's darkness didn't always show up as physical violence. Sometimes it showed up as ego, public humiliation, and ice-cold control that could ruin an entire production. Born in 1941 in Bascom, Florida, Dunaway shot to stardom fast. Bonnie and Clyde in '67, Chinatown in '74, hit after hit. She looked untouchable, almost like a goddess with that cool magnetic presence. But behind the glamour, people in the industry whispered about how difficult she was. Crew members talked about her tantrums, impossible demands, and the way she treated assistants like they were beneath her. Her mommy dearest co-star, Rutanya Alda, once said you could feel the fear on set, like everyone was just waiting for the next explosion. That movie, which was supposed to expose emotional abuse, became, in a lot of people's eyes, a mirror of Dunaway's own behavior. While playing Joan Crawford, a woman famous for being cruel, Dunaway reportedly acted the same way during filming. Director Frank Perry later admitted he almost quit the project because of her extreme outbursts. She threw things, tore into makeup artists, and once refused to film until the lighting made her look absolutely perfect. Ron Howard would later point to her as an example of what happens when an actor's need for control goes too far. And the stories kept coming. On The Wicked Lady, she allegedly slapped a cameraman. On Don Juan DeMarco, crew members said she humiliated assistants so badly.
John Wayne, the icon who wasn't what he seemed. Not many Hollywood stars stood as tall as John Wayne, literally or figuratively. To millions of Americans, he was what this country stood for. The cowboy, the soldier, the tough guy who never quit. But to Ron Howard, who grew up watching those westerns on TV, the truth behind that legendary image was much harder to swallow. Howard once said that when he learned who John Wayne really was, the hero image just vanished. He stopped seeing the hero and started seeing the bully who wrapped himself in the flag. That realization hit him hard. Born Marion Morrison in Iowa in 1907, Wayne worked his way through Hollywood by selling a fantasy of toughness, the kind of manliness that audiences ate up. By the 1950s, Wayne wasn't just acting, he was promoting a whole way of thinking. He saw anyone who disagreed with him as weak, and any kind of change as un-American. On movie sets, he ruled through intimidation, not leadership. If technicians didn't meet his standards, he'd yell at them in front of everyone. Actor Christopher Mitchum once said that when Duke got angry, the whole place went silent, and you either agreed with Wayne or you were out. Howard later said this kind of environment had nothing to do with making good movies. It was fear dressed as discipline. Wayne's bad behavior didn't stop at yelling either. He regularly put down women, made fun of Native American performers working on westerns, and dismissed black actors who pushed back against stereotypical roles. His 1971 Playboy interview still shocks people today.
Roman Polanski, talent can't excuse everything. For Ron Howard, Roman Polanski's name represents one of the hardest truths Hollywood ever tried to ignore. Brilliant work doesn't excuse terrible actions. Howard once said how painful it was to realize the truth about the filmmaker behind movies he'd admired. He explained that he respected Polanski's films before he knew the whole story, but then he understood that talent doesn't let anyone off the hook. Sometimes it just hides who they really are. Polanski's rise looked unstoppable. Born in Paris in 1933 to Polish parents and surviving World War II horrors, he lived through tragedy long before Hollywood knew his name. Early films like Knife in the Water and Rosemary's Baby made him a critical darling, a director who could turn dread into chilling art. But as Howard later said, the darkness in Polanski's movies wasn't just storytelling. It reflected a troubled man hiding behind the camera. In 1977, everything changed. Polanski was arrested after an incident involving a young teenage girl following a photo shoot. The legal evidence was strong enough that he pleaded guilty to unlawful conduct with a minor, a serious admission that should have meant real consequences. But before sentencing could happen, Polanski fled the United States and settled in France, refusing to come back. Hollywood split right down the middle. Some people condemned him completely, while others defended him as a troubled artist, a divide that still exists today. For Howard, who was a young filmmaker watching this unfold, the reaction was heartbreaking. They talked about art while a child's life was shattered, he said years later, pointing out how the industry twisted itself in knots instead of doing the right thing.
Mickey Rooney, the smile that hid the pain. If Polanski showed Hollywood's double standards, Mickey Rooney showed its illusion, the idea that charm could cover up the damage someone caused. For Ron Howard, who once watched Rooney's cheerful musicals on late-night TV, learning the truth about him felt like a punch in the gut. He was the face of happiness, Howard said once, but behind that smile was misery, and worse, he spread it around. Born Joseph Yule Jr. in 1920, Rooney became Hollywood's first huge child star. By 18, he was the highest-paid actor in America, with MGM building their whole empire around his energy and grin. But that kind of fame twisted him early on, and as he grew up, so did the chaos around him. He married 8 times, cheated constantly, gambled away fortunes, and left emotional wreckage everywhere he went. His ex-wife, Ava Gardner, once said he was the shortest man with the biggest ego in the world. Behind closed doors, things only got worse. In 2011, accusations came out involving his 8th wife, Jan Chamberlain, and her son, both accused of isolating Rooney and taking control of his money. But long before these problems, stories about Rooney's own difficult behavior were already legendary. Former co-workers described him as unpredictable and mean-spirited. Judy Garland, his closest friend during the MGM years, once said privately that he could make you laugh one minute and tear you down the next. Garland, who was pushed hard by studio bosses and struggled emotionally, later hinted that Rooney, not just the executives, shared some blame for the pain she went through during those early years. By the 1960s, his career was falling apart. Scandals, addiction, and financial disasters followed him everywhere. In a 1979 interview, Rooney said he lived 1,000 lives. But as Howard later thought about it, he lived them all for himself. Even in old age, Rooney's bitterness never seemed to fade. He blamed the studios, former partners, friends, even fate itself for how his life fell apart. When he died in 2014 at 93, he left behind less than $20,000, and nobody claimed his body at first until friends raised money for a simple burial in Los Angeles. For Ron Howard, Rooney's story was the final piece of the puzzle, proof that many of Hollywood's brightest smiles were hiding heavy secrets. He made the world laugh while he was dying inside, Howard said, calling it the saddest kind of tragedy, when someone's pain becomes their performance and nobody sees it until it's too late. To Howard,
These stories were never about getting revenge or tearing people down. They were warnings. The Golden Age we all remember so fondly, it wasn't golden at all. It was built on secrets, pressure, and hidden lives covered up by fame. And as he once said, the scariest monsters aren't in horror movies. They're the ones the spotlight protects. I'd love to hear what you think about all this. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. If this story meant something to you, hit that like button. And please subscribe so we can keep sharing these important stories together.